Today we're going to be learning Sotah Daf Yomi. We're going to start at the very bottom, finish up our topic of Miriam. So our last question was, why is Miriam, when she goes to sing at the Shirat Hayam, when she sings with the women, why is she called, after the splitting of the sea, why is she called Miriam Nevi'ah Achot Aharon, the sister of Aaron? Wasn't she also the sister of Moshe? Which Rav Nachman says in the name of Rav. Melamed Shaitam Nab'ah Kashi Achot Aharon, very bottom of yesterday's daf. She prophesied when she was the sister of Aaron, and she would say, Atidai Moshe Tele Ben Shemoshiach Israel. She was already a prophet way back when she was very young, and she was only Aaron's sister. And then she said, my mother is going to give birth to the child who is going to be the savior of the Jewish people. Moshe, and as soon as Moshe was born, or as we saw before, the house was filled with light. The father stood up and kissed his daughter. Amarla, your prophecies have come true. But when they had to go 3 months later and throw him into the Nile, and then he slapped her on the head and said, Amarla, biti, my daughter, right? Trigger warning about the slapping. Okay, we know that was more common in those days. And again, this didn't necessarily happen. This is a midrash. Where are your prophecies now? He's clearly not going to save the Jewish people. We have to throw him into the Nile. And that explains this pasuk. She stood from a distance. Why was she the one? To see what will become of him. Why? What will become of him, right? It could have said, what will happen to him? Why? She wanted to know what will be in the future. Will he really end up saving the Jewish people or not? This, by the way, explains a number of things. You might have thought, we saw before, and the Nar was Bocheh. We said the Nar, according to, didn't appear in our Gemara, but another Midrash, it says it was Aharon, trying to place Aharon at the scene, which is really both addressing the same question is, why did Miriam go and not Aharon? So here it shows she had a motivation, which is she wanted to know if her prophecy was really going to come true. The second question I would ask is, why weren't her parents there? Wouldn't you think the parents would go to check what was going to happen to their child? So it seems a little strange. Why did Miriam go? And now we understand, at least this addresses it, whether it's the best answer we can get to, I don't know, but it addresses why Miriam specifically is the one, because she wanted to know, are my prophecies really going to come true? It also could be that she the most believed that it would happen because she saw in a prophecy that he was going to be a great man and therefore really believed something would happen to him and therefore, wanted to see how he was going to get saved and kind of see how things were going to go. Yosef Zaha, finished with Miriam, now moving on to Yosef. Yosef got rewarded measure for measure. He buried his father, took care of that. Therefore, Moshe buried him. We're now going to look at the whole story of when Yosef buries his father. It says, Vayal Yosef likbor et aviv, v'yalu ito kol avdei paro. So first it describes in the pasuk, we're in chapter 50 of Breshit, verses 7 and 8. Verse 7 says, Yosef goes to bury his father, and with him, right, they go back to Maarat Hamachpela, and with him goes all of the servants of Paro, and the Zkenim of Paro, his important people. The Hadar, and the next pasuk says, V'chol beit Yosef ve'echav u'beit aviv, and all the house of Yosef, and his brothers, and his father's family. So the order is, Yosef is the Paro's people, and right, the Egyptians, and then the brothers, and Yosef's children. But at the end, when they're coming back, it says, Vayashav Yosef Mitzrayim hu ve'echav. He and his brothers go back to Egypt. And then it says, and everybody else who went with him to bury his father. So it's like an ABBA structure. Why does it start with him, the Egyptians, the brothers, and then goes to the brothers and back to the Egyptians? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan. In the beginning, they didn't treat the Jews so much with respect. They didn't realize what a great man Yaakov was and how great his family was. So, they went probably out of respect for Yosef, and they basically said, well, we're walking first. More respectful people go at the head. But when they realized the kavod of the family, and on the way back, they let the brothers go first. Now, what did they exactly see? We're going to figure this out right now. Okay, so when they go, this is in verse 10. It says they got to Goren Ha'atad, which is Goren is a threshing floor, in a place where they often stored the wheat and then did the threshing. And atad is thorn bush. So what does a thorn bush have to do with goren? Atad? What does a thorn bush have to do with a goren? Goren doesn't have thorn bushes. Well, it does have thorn bushes. Where? Around it. So you don't thresh thorns, but you put them around to protect the area. So they surrounded the coffin of Yaakov with crowns, just like the threshing floor is surrounded with these thorn bushes as a way of protecting it. Now, this is when it was full of all these crowns. Whose crowns were these? Well, Shabal, B'nai Esau, B'nai Ishmael, B'nai Keturah, the sons of Esau, the sons of Ishmael, the sons of Keturah. Tana kulam l'milchama ba'u. Now, why did they all come to the burial? They actually came to create a war. We're always at war with these nations. But kevan shera'u kitro shel Yosef taloi ba'arono shel Yaakov. But then they saw the crown of Joseph on the aron, and they realized, wow, this man is a real leader, Yosef. And then they decided, natnu kulam kitrehen. They took all their crowns down, utla'um ba'arono shel Yaakov, and they all gave Yaakov the proper respect. So we ended up with these 36 crowns. How do we get to 36? So Yosef is one. How do we get to 35? So Rashi gives one interpretation. There were 12 Nesiim of Yishmael and 23 Alufim of Esau. He then says, it's a bit of a problem. There's 25. What do we do with that? We say Timan and Nazir twice. Okay, tries to get through the count. But there's others that give different counts because where's B'nai Keturah? They're not there. So anyway, there's a bit of a debate about how to get to these numbers. Also, it's this magic number 36 that we always like, which is, we're going to see right now, I forgot, I actually didn't read it yet. Tana shloshim v'shisha ktarim nitzlu ba'arono shel Yaakov. Sorry, I didn't read that first. But the 36, the Midrash says there were 36 of them that were put on, and that's how we get to that number. Again, according to Rashi, the Rush has a different count, or others have a different count. Anyway, the point being that now go back to the beginning. What did we say? When the Egyptians saw the 36 crowns of all these other nations on the grave of Yaakov, they realized, wow, this is a prominent person, and we should treat his children with respect as well. And that's why on the way back, his children went first. We also saw that when they came first to fight the other nations, and then they ended up, right, the brothers and uncles, right, and then they realized, Ishmael and Esau and Keturah, they all realized that Yaakov is deserving of greatness. Now we're going to see some other things here. And a bit of a different version of the Milchama here didn't end as peacefully as this one did. So then it says they mourned for him a big mourning. Even the donkeys and the horses also was part of the eulogized, or exactly what they did is a good question. Some people say, right, first of all, it's probably just meant to say, it was such a big thing that even the animals were part of it, which even though they weren't really. Some people say they dressed the animals with clothing of mourning. Some people say when the people cried, so the animals mimicked their crying and therefore were part of it. Okay, different explanation. But again, the idea is just to say this was a huge event. So here's another version of the story. Okay, so afilu susim, afilu chamurim, and then it continues. Well, they got to Maarat Hamachpela. Ata Esau kama. Esau got there and said, wait a minute, what are you doing? Why are you burying him here? Amar lahem, right? The brother, twin brother. He's like, you're not burying Yaakov here. Amar lahem, mamre kiryat arba yechevron. And the pasuk says mamre kiryat arba, right? The area is called Kiryat 4, which is Chevron. What's 4? And Rabbi Yitzchak kiryat arba zugotay. Maarat Hamachpela is known, right? That's why it's called Kiryat Arba there. 4 pairs, right? 4 couples. Adam and Chava, couple number 1. Avraham and Sarah, couple number 2. Yitzchak and Rivka, couple number 3. And Yaakov and Leah, couple number 4. Well, comes Esau and says, wait a minute. Leah's buried there right now. And you want to bury Yaakov next to her? You buried Leah in your spot. The 2 spots were for me and you. The Haidafai is Jidiyu, and the one that's left is mine. Amrule Zabinte. So the sons of Yaakov say, wait, you sold it to him. So Amar Lahu, Nihid Zabini Bechiruta, Pshituta Mizabinye. Bechor is the firstborn. Pshita is a non-firstborn. He says, yeah, I might have sold you my firstborn. I didn't sell you my regular portion. This is mine. What are you talking about? I didn't sell this. They said, yes, you did. How do we know? Dichtiv, because Yaakov tells, he makes Well, the truth is, he makes Yosef swear that he's going to take him to be buried in Canaan. And when Yosef recounts this at the time, at the end of Sefer, right, this is in the same chapter, in chapter 50, verse 5, when Yaakov tells Paro that we have to go bury him there, he says, Avi hishbi'ani lemor, my father made me swear to say, Hinei anochi met, bikivri asher kariti li be'eretz Canaan. Shama tikberuni, go bury me in the place that I now kariti. Kariti usually means dug, okay? But what does it mean? Bikivri asher kariti lo? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak. Ein kira ela lashon mechira. Kira is from the language of mechira. Okay, you see the same letters, kaf and resh. And mem, I sold, I bought, right? There was a sale here. Okay, in the places by the water, that's always where they learn about words, etymologies. They call the word mechira kira. So here you have it. I bought it, they said. Yaakov told us he bought it from you. Amar lehu. So what does he obviously say? Habali Igarta, pull out your bill of sale. That's a great story. Amrule, Igarta Maarat Mitzrayim. They said, well, you could bring it with us. Who thought we needed to bring it? It's in Egypt. Well, we have to go get it because he's obviously not going to let us bury Yaakov. Uman Nezel, who's going to go? Nezel Naftali. Naftali will go. Why? The Khalil ki ayalta diktiv Naftali ayala shlucha hanoten imrei shafer. So, Amar Rabbi Abau, how do we understand this pasuk? This is a pasuk from the brachot that Yaakov gave to his sons. Okay, the ones who speak words of Torah or words of the book. But anyway, what do we see here? Imrei Sefer, they brought the words that were written down. In other words, he's an ayala shlucha. He was sent as a messenger like an ayal, very fast, and bringing, right, giving Imrei Sefer. He brought the words, sorry, I said it was Torah, not Torah. He brought the words that were written in the book, okay? He was the one who went to get the deed. So, here's our story. They're standing there. They're about to bury Esau. They send Naftali back to get the bill of sale. Esau not letting them bury. Comes Chushim. Chushim, who is Chushim? Berei de Dan. He's the son of Dan. Taman Hava, he happened to be there at the time, right? Because they were all there. V'yakirin le'udne. He was hard of hearing. Amar lehu, so he sees this whole hustle bustle going on. He doesn't understand. He sees like, aren't we going to bury Yaakov? And he sees no one's burying him. My hi, he says, what's going on here? Can someone explain it to me? I can't hear. Well, we're delaying till Naftali gets back from Egypt, right? They didn't have airplanes at the time. They didn't have fast-speed trains. And nowadays, there aren't fast-speed trains there either between Israel and Egypt, right? Maybe one day. But basically, he says, we got to wait. There's nothing to do. Well, Amar lehu, Naftali, me'ar de Mitzrayim, he says, until Naftali gets there from Egypt, my grandfather's going to be sitting there in bizayon. And this is a shanda. How could you do this? This is not manageable. Okay, we can't stand here waiting for Naftali to get back and let my grandfather's body rot. They didn't have morgues in those days. They didn't have ice. Nothing. No way, no how. He says. Shakal kulfa. He picks up a club. Machia Reshe. He kills Esau Bamakom, right there. Natran Eine, so the eyes of Esau pop out of his head. V'naflo akar Yaakov, and they fall in Yaakov's legs. Patchinu Yaakov le'ene. Okay, Yaakov's dead, but his eyes open up, va'achech, and he smiles. Okay, obviously he didn't wake up from the dead, but what we're trying to say is there was a certain amount of pleasure from this incident. Why? Tzaddik will be happy because he saw revenge taking place. And he'll wash his feet in the blood of the wicked one, okay, which doesn't really mean it, but it means he'll benefit from the death of the wicked, which in this case, it was a real benefit to Yaakov. Okay, maybe we don't really believe in violence, and this might not have been the best way to go about it, but on the other hand, to let Yaakov's body rot there just because Esau was making a whole big deal of something that wasn't true, again, our belief, right? Our side of the story is it wasn't true. So this was a glorious act that Chushim, the son of Dan, took care of. Before we move on, I just want to think about this Chushim and what we can learn from this story. So Chush means sense, senses, like your Chushim. Your Chushim are your senses. You have 5 senses. What's interesting, Chushim was missing one of his senses, right? He didn't have his hearing. and therefore supposedly didn't know what was going on. On the other hand, what it shows you here is that when you don't have all your senses, we all know that sometimes it means your other senses are much sharper. And maybe because you don't have the distraction of hearing, that he was the only one who really saw the story for what it was. He's the only one who came up with a solution. Again, you might not be agreeing with his solution of violence, but he clearly saved the day here. And everyone else wasn't thinking clearly. They were busy listening to the argument of Esau and trying to get involved in the nitty gritty. And sometimes you need someone with perspective who can see. And often the person whose senses are weakened in one area might have better senses. Also, the word lachush is to feel, to sense what was really needed. He had a much sharper insight into the real situation and what needed to be done. And he just took care of it right when it needed to be done. So it's very interesting the way the story portrays the person who's hard of hearing as the one who has the most sense, who has the most understanding more than anybody else. It's a great story. Again, other than the violence. This was actually came to fruition, the prophecy that Rivka had said, not really knowing she was prophesizing. But so I don't want to lose both my sons in one day, right? That's why she sends Yaakov away when Esau wants to kill him after he steals the brachot. So even though they didn't really die in one day, but they both got buried on the same day. So now that's the story of Yaakov's death. Now they want to know, wait a minute. And that was Yosef buried. But if Yosef hadn't buried, what, the brothers wouldn't have? They wouldn't have buried him. Doesn't it say the sons all carried him to Eretz Canaan. So the brothers were there. They could have, but they said, you know what? It's more respectful for Yaakov that Yosef bury him because Yosef was a very prominent person, which is also, it's alluded to in that previous story with all the crowns. They saw Yosef's crown and then they realized we should put our crowns there as well. Milanu gadol mi Yosef. So now we say, what was Yosef's reward? Moshe buries him. Tanu Rabbanan. Bo ra'eh kama chavivot mitzvot Moshe Rabbeinu. Shekol Yisrael kulan nitasku b'biza. V'hu nitasek b'mitzvot. How much did Moshe Rabbeinu love doing mitzvot? And when it came time to leave Egypt, everyone's busy taking all the jewels from the Mitzrayim, right? It says by Mitzrayim. They took a lot of their jewelry with them. And he was busy doing mitzvot. What was he doing? Shenemar, first of all, it says about him, Chacham Levi Kach mitzvot. Okay, that's just a pasuk saying, I assume it's from Mishle. I didn't check. Sounds like a pasuk, yes. From Mishle, someone who's wise will do mitzvot. And he basically goes to take the bones of Yosef. Okay, this it says in the psukim, the Vayikach Moshe Atzmot Yosef, right? He takes them with him, Imo. Now, Yosef is buried by the Egyptians. So how on earth did he know? You might remember at the end of Sefer Breshit, Yosef says, promise me you'll bury me in Canaan. And then basically right, I'll just open the pasuk for a minute. It's good to see. Vayishpa Yosef ben Israel, it's almost the second to last pasuk in Breshit, Sefer Breshit. Lemor fakod yifchod Elohim etchem. God will redeem you. And when he does, make sure to bring my bones with you. So he makes them swear. Same thing with Yaakov made Yosef swear. That's why these stories are also compared. So what happens in this story? Well, how did Moshe know where Yosef was buried? The Egyptians buried Yosef. Amru Serach bat Asher. She's this woman who's listed in these lists of genealogy in the Torah. So Serach bat Asher, no one really knows why she's listed by name, and because of that, they give her all sorts of stories are associated with Serach bat Asher. You can Google it. There's a lot of interesting stories about her. Well, what do they say about her? Nishtayra me'oto ador. She was a super, super old woman who was still she's one of the people who came into Egypt, the daughter of Asher, and she was still there when they got out of Egypt, 210 years later, and she was obviously even born before that. Well, she was very old. Now, this is the Midrash likes to have people appear in all different times in history. Okay, like we saw Moshe, Yitro, and Bil'am, and Paro, and Eov all together, right? Even though, reasonable, right? We don't know when Eov lived actually, but Eov comes up in a bunch of generations, and according to the Gemara. Anyway, Halach Moshe Etzla, Amarla, Klumat Jordat Echan Yosef Kavor. Figures she's the only one left from that generation. Maybe she knows. Do you know where Yosef is buried? Amralo, she says to him, and this is version number 1. We're going to see a different version of the story. Aron shamatechet asulam mitzrim. They made him a metal coffin. Ukba'u b'nilu sanar, and they put it in the Nile. Today, sheet barchu meimav. They wanted the waters to overflow. And we always talk about, the Torah talks about how Mitzrayim, the waters are overflowing, and in Israel, we're dependent on the rainwater. So here we have, why was it always overflowing? According to this midrash, it's because they put Yosef's coffin there, and that helped their waters to be blessed. Because again, Yaakov brought the blessing of the 7 plentiful years. They viewed that he was responsible for all that, for all their wealth in the end. I mean, he really did bring their wealth. And they figured whatever he touches will be blessed. So even in his death, maybe he could bless us. It also, by the way, takes out this whole special bracha that Mitzrayim has and kind of attributes it to Yosef. Well, halach Moshe v'amar asfat hanil. So Moshe went and sat on the edge of the Nile. Amar lo, now he had no idea where in the Nile it was. He didn't have divers there to help him go search. Amar lo, Yosef, higia et shenishbach kadosh baruch hu shani goel etchem. Remember he said, when pakod yivkod etchem, when God remembers you. So he said, the time for God came. He's redeeming us. V'higia shvuah sheshbat et Yisrael. And now the time has come for us to pay our oath, to fulfill it. If you go show me right now where you are, great. But if you don't, well, we'll be free from our oath. In other words, we've done our share. We've tried to find you. We have no way to find you. Either come out and we'll help you, or not, and you can't hold us responsible. Immediately a miracle happens, right? Besides the miracle of Serach bat Asher telling him where to find the coffin, which, by the way, it could be also the Mitzrayim were hiding it. They didn't want the Jews to leave, and they knew that he had made this promise, so he knew they couldn't leave without the bones, so maybe they tried to hide it so that they would never find it. Well, miracle happens, and the coffin rises up. You might have said, don't wonder how an iron thing could float, right? It should usually sink. And now we're going to prove another story where a miracle like this happened. This is one of those small stories in Elisha, in the stories of Elisha the prophet, where he does all these miracles. So one of the stories is in Sefer Melachim Bet, Kings 2. He was chopping down a tree, and a piece of his axe fell off and went into the water. And he says, "Aha, doni v'hu Shaul." He goes to Elisha and he says, "What am I going to do? This is borrowed. I have to return it." Naftali said, "Where? Show me the general area." He showed him the place. He cuts a piece of wood. He puts it into the water. And the barzel rises up. So now the Gemara says, well, you can make a kavachomer argument. This is really showing hierarchy. Elisha learned from Moshe. Moshe learned from, Elisha learned from Eliyahu. Eliyahu learned from Moshe. He didn't exactly learn from Moshe, but he was basically, maybe the student of the student. Also, some people say Eliyahu was Pinchas, and Pinchas was a student of Moshe. Saf Barzel Mipanav, and even though he was lower, right, again, it's just showing hierarchy. Moshe, Eliyahu, Elisha. And yet Elisha was able to do this magic, right, this miracle. Moshe Rabbeinu, although the more so for Moshe, who called for this miracle, it would different version of the story. But he was buried in a crypt of kings. And we all know the Egyptians buried in these unique ways. He was in one of those, but they weren't labeled. Halach Moshe, so he goes and he stands next to the crypt. Amar, same thing. Yosef, the time has come. We're supposed to be leaving. The time to pay back to fulfill your oath is here. If you show me where you are, great. But if not, we're going to have to leave, and without you, and it's not our fault. All of a sudden, it started shaking. Again, a sign. This is where I am. So again, this miracle happened. It started to move, and Moshe took it with him. So this coffin of Moshe, of Yosef, went along with them in the desert everywhere they went, with another one. What was in the other Aron? Obviously, the Aron Habrit, right? The Luchot. One carried the dead body, the dead bones of Yosef, and one carried the presence of God, which was this second Aron Habrit. Kind of was represented with the presence of God with the 10 Commandments in them. They walked side by side, these two boxes. People would see them and say, what are these two boxes you're carrying? So they'd say, one is a dead body and one is the Shekhinah, presence of God. So which people would say, that doesn't make sense that a dead body would walk alongside with the presence of God. They said, so they said very beautifully, this one, the dead one, Yosef fulfilled all the commandments that are in the second one, even though there weren't commandments when Yosef was alive, but the idea is he fulfilled them anyway. Moshe. Now we ask the same question we asked before about Yosef burying Yaakov, what the brothers wouldn't have. If Moshe hadn't done it, Israel, what the Jews wouldn't have. And in fact, when it talks about, and we'll get to this contradiction in a bit, in Sefer Yoshua, when it talks about that the Jews buried him in Israel and Shechem, it says, and it describes the atzmot of Yosef that Bnei Israel brought out of Egypt. So not only could they have, but it seems they even did, but we'll get to that part. But right now they're saying, couldn't they have dealt with it? And furthermore, but forget, they wouldn't have dealt with it. At least the sons of Yosef would have dealt with his bones, and it's his family. B'aktiv, and it even says, Yosef l'nachala. Okay, in that pasuk, it says they took the bones of Yosef, they buried him in Shechem, in the part of the field that Yaakov bought from the sons of Hamor, Avi Shechem, b'me'at Sotah, and they were for Bnei Yosef l'nachala. So in other words, it ends up being in their possession. So of course they would have dealt with it. So Amru, the sons of Yosef, said, much rather that Yosef be buried by everybody rather than just our family. That's why they left it to everybody else. And the rest of the Jewish people said, leave it for Moshe, because better someone of great import does it than someone who's just a small person. So now it says they buried them in Shechem. Yosef in Shechem. Why specifically in Shechem? Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, Mishchem geravuhu u'lishchem nachzir avedato. In Shechem was where they stole him and they sold him off. Therefore, they wanted to end his life. They wanted to return him back to where he was lost from. Very interesting. Even though it happened in Dotan, not in Shechem, but Dotan is near Shechem. Some people say Dotan isn't really a name of a place. It's just a name they gave it, and really it was Shechem. Okay. Now we go back to this contradiction. So who took them, the Jews or Moshe? Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, Kolo said davar below Gemaro, uba'achiru Gemaro, v'alav katuv asher Gemaro ke'ilu asao. It's very interesting. We all know about this. They say, finish the job, right? If you start something and you don't finish it, well, if someone else finishes it, they get the credit as if they did. So Moshe in the end didn't finish the job, not because it was his fault. He couldn't go into the land of Israel, so he obviously couldn't finish it. He started it, but since he didn't finish, it gets called in the name of the people who finished it. They finished it without finishing it, the job wouldn't have been done, so therefore it gets called in their name. Rabbi Elazar Omer, if you start something and you don't finish it, and you could have finished it, not like Moshe in this case, but you could have, you get taken down from your high place in society. When Yehuda goes down, and then the whole problem comes up with his sons dying and his wife dying, and then he ends up with Tamar, and in the end the story ends up good, as we saw the other day, but it starts off with a Yeridah of Yehuda. Why a Yeridah? Because it was right after the chapter where they throw Yosef in the pit, and Yehuda wants to save him, but in the end he doesn't fully save him, and therefore he didn't finish the job, and because of that he goes down. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Omer, Af kover ishto banat. Here's his real punishment. And this, we learn from Yehuda that this is true for anyone else. If you don't finish the job, you bury your wife and your children. The Tiv, again, doesn't really mean this is directly going to happen, but it's saying it's quite severe. We really don't approve of this kind of thing. As you see by Yehuda, Batamat Batshua ish Yehuda, Uchtiv vayamat Erev Onan. In case of Batshua dies, and Aaron Onan dies. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar, Mipnei ma nikra Yosef atzamot b'chayav. Okay, so Yosef tells them, bury my bones. Okay, now why is he called bones? It should be called, right? It should be called something more positive, right? Bury me. Why does it say bones specifically? Okay, so now the question, they're going to say, why was he called bones? And it's going to be as a punishment for him. Okay, so now it says, while he was still alive, right? He says, you're going to take my bones. Instead of saying, you're going to take my body. So it says, why was he called bones? Well, he got punished for something. There was a case where his father's respect was under question here, or was disrespect for his father, and he didn't say anything about it. What is that? His brothers said to him, when his brothers didn't recognize him in the beginning, they say, your servant, our father. Now, his father was not his servant, right? It was his father. Now, he couldn't have really said anything, but he didn't correct them. And therefore, he got punished because it was out of lack of respect for his father, and he ends up getting called bones in his life. Even though he called himself, but the pasuk talks about him as bones before he's even dead. Okay, one of them said it. Why did he die first? Which is described in end of Sefer Breshit. Because he put himself higher than everyone else. He took his power into his hands a little too much, right? It got to his head. But Yosef hu Rab Mitzrayim. Okay, now we go back to the beginning of the story. When he gets taken to Mitzrayim, he gets taken down, they say to Mitzrayim, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Al tekahu Rab ela hori. When he got to Egypt, what does he manage to do? It's not that he was taken down, he took people down. Who did he take down? Shorid istagnine paro migdulatan. The istagninim, all those ones who looked at the stars for Paro and had all the answers. Well, when it came to the dream, they couldn't answer his dream, and Yosef did. So he basically put them all down. Then it says Potiphar bought him for himself. So Amarav shekna'ol atzmo. Rav says he bought him for himself for sexual activity with him. And then whether you read the first line, Ba Gavriel v'Sirso, that's in parentheses. Maybe you don't read that. And Ba Gavriel u'Pero. Okay, Palat is to cut. Serus is to castrate. So either he castrated him and then even cut off more, or Pero is just a stronger language of castrating, like a very serious castration, and then it's just one language. But either which way, Meikara. How do we know this? Because Meikara k'tiv Potifar ulevasof Potifera. They call them Potifar and then they call them Potifera. Fera is wild, is also from the lashon of to cut, to pull back. He obviously was castrated. That's why, not obviously. The drasha is assuming Pera had to do with the castration. And from there we get that he was castrated. Again, it's just a drasha. Mi lanu gadol mi Moshe, who is great as Moshe, right? Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God himself, who buries Moshe. That's his reward. So now we're going to talk about the death of Moshe. First, we have this discussion that goes on in Parshat Va'etchanan and Sefer Dvarim, where God says, right, Moshe explains to the Jews how he prayed for God to, this is after he sinned with the water. We talked about the whole thing with the water the other day. And then it says, Vayidaber Hashem bi l'ma'anchem v'lo shama elai. Okay, I beseech God, right? And he didn't listen to me, right, on your behalf, and he didn't listen to me. Vayomer Hashem elai, rav lach, al tosef daber elai od b'davar hazeh. God says, rav lach, it's too much for me, or too much for you. Stop talking to me about this. Don't ask me again to go into Egypt, to go into Israel. Okay, don't ask. This is like when you say to your kids, right, we're done, no more. But why does he say rav lach? Why that extra language? So, Vayomer Hashem elai rav lach, Amar Rabbi Levi, berav biser berav bisruhu. He announced with the word rav, and he was announced too about using that same word. What does that mean? Berav biser rav lachem. He announced to who? To Korach. He said, rav lachem b'nei Levi. What is it? So much you want all the greatness, right? You're trying to take too much. Berav bisruhu rav lach. So God says to him, what? You're asking for too much, right? You want everything. Davar acher, a different interpretation. Rav lach, rav yetzlach, umanu Yoshua. There's someone to replace you, which could be in one hand, don't worry about leaving. I'll give you someone, there's someone in your place. Or it could be more like to make him jealous, there's someone else, you're replaceable. Don't think you're not replaceable. Davar acher, rav lach, shelo yomur harav kama kasher, tami kama sarvan. So people won't say, rav lach means, so people won't say how rav is about God and lach is about you. People won't stop asking me because people are going to say, oh, what a harsh God. He's not listening to his student, begging him. And number two, they're going to look at the student, oh, what a beggar. Like, come on, why are you begging so much? Like, let it go. Why is God so harsh with Moshe? According to the camel is the load. Which means basically, it's in other words, we also have a different phrase that God treats the tzaddikim kechut hasa'ara, right? He's careful with them. He's very careful with them like a thin hair. In other words, any little thing they do gets punished because they're so great. They therefore get treated on a very individual level, and they get treated more severely because the expectations are higher. So when Moshe is about to die, he says, I'm 120 years today. Why do you need to say today? What he's saying is today is my birthday. Okay? It's a complete year. This is where we get when Moshe was born, because God, which we talked about the other day, God completes their days exactly and their months. So, which is another pasuk, I will fill your days, meaning basically you're going to die on the day of your birthday. So that's why he was born on the day that he died on Zayin Adar, the 7th of Adar. Okay, next. Moshe says, I can't go in and out anymore. Let's take a level usually means to go out in war. So what does it mean? To go in and out, whether to war or just to walk around. It says, Haktiv, Moshe the description at the end of Sefer Devarim, Moshe was 120 in his death, lo nas lecho, and he was just as young as he was earlier. Uchtiv vayal Moshe me'arvot Moav al Har Nevo, and it says he went up to Har Nevo where he was going to die. It says there were 12 steps to get up there. And he basically took one step and got up to the top. So again, you see he had all his strength with him at that age. So what does it mean? Let's say Torah. This is like the biggest punishment for someone like Moshe Rabbeinu. He could no longer talk divrei Torah. He lost his intelligence, right? One of his greatest strengths he could no longer have. So now Moshe and Yoshua go to Ol Moed according to the pasuk. It says, this is in Sefer Devarim, chapter 31. Hashem says to Moshe, you're getting ready to die. Call Yoshua, and both of you go to Ol Moed. And then it says they both went, and they went to Ol Moed. So what do we learn here? Tanao ta Shabbat shel dio zuge haita. That Shabbat was two leaders, dio like duo. Okay, two. Nitla v'shut mizem and nitna listen. Okay, so basically the rule was taken from Moshe and given to Yoshua. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, were it not for a pasuk, I wouldn't be able to say this. What am I going to say? Hold off for a minute. Take a little while to get there. Well, Echan Moshe min, where did he die? Okay, another miraculous thing happens in his death that I would never believe had it not been referenced in the psukim. So he dies in the section of Reuven. How do we know this? He goes up to Har Nevo. Nevo is in the section of Reuven. How do we know this? At Nevo. Okay, they build all these places, and Nevo. Nevo is in Reuven. Hechan Moshe kavol b'chalko shel Gad. And Moshe is buried. Okay, I skipped the part in parentheses. Moshe is buried in the section of Gad. Dichtiv v'yal reshit lo. And then it continues. This is the bracha for God. And it says, Chalkat mechokek safun. The section of the mechokek, the one who made the laws, that's Moshe, is safun, is hidden in your territory. So here you see that it was dafka in God. So now they say, so he died in the Shetach of Reuven, and then he gets buried in God's area. How much space between there and there? 4 mil. Otan 4 milin, who carried him those 4 mil? Moshe mutal. This is the part that was hard to believe otherwise. Moshe was mutal b'kamfei Ashkenaz. Moshe was literally in the wings of the presence of God. And while God was carrying him this whole way, the angels are singing. It's like kind of this beautiful view of Moshe's death. You have God carrying in his angel wings. And the angels are saying, Tzidkat Hashem asau mishpatav in Israel. Look, God does righteousness with those, right, with the Jews, and right, his laws are with the Jews, his righteousness is with the Jews. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, and God is saying at the same time, now we're going to have a slew of options of what God was saying while he was carrying Moshe in his arms. Who's going to stand with me now when I have evil people in front of me? Moshe was always the one to say, don't punish them, and now I don't have anyone to do that anymore. Somewhat similar, who is so wise that knows pesher? Pesher is to do pshara, compromise. And Moshe was a good compromise man. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, where am I going to find wisdom? Moshe had infinite wisdom. Rabbi Nachman Amar, Moshe. He was just saying, Moshe died, right? Like, I can't believe Moshe died. Samalyon Amar, Moshe, Safar Rabbi Yisrael. Moshe died, but was trying to say, a great leader among the Jewish people has died, right? Kind of announcing it. And this announcing thing we're going to see now in the next source. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Agadol Mil. Shneim Asar Mil, Shneim Asar Mil, Keneged Mechnei Israel. There's 12 mil by 12 mil, which was the whole size of the camp of the Jewish people. Bat Kol Mashmiya, over that whole area, there was a heavenly voice that came down and said, Vayamat Moshe Safer Rabbanit Yisrael, and was announcing Moshe died to everybody. V'yesh Omrim, Lo Meit Moshe. Some people say Moshe never really died, kind of like the Eliyahu. Ktiv hacha vayamat sham, uktiv hatam, because it says vayamat there, sham, and it says also in another pasuk when Moshe goes up to Har Sinai to be with God, it says vayihi sham im Hashem. He was there with God. So that same word sham appears in both. Ma lahalan omedu mishamesh, just like there he was serving God. Afkan omedu mishamesh. He basically went up to the heavens to serve God, and he's been serving God up in the heavens since then and never really died. Right? Again, this isn't necessarily meant to be understood literally. It's kind of the idea of his legacy lives on forever, and he was forever a servant of God. Or maybe you can think of other things it's trying to say. But again, most of these stories, as we've been learning for many, many days at this point, are really not meant to be understood literally, right? Like Chushim killing Esau, right? It didn't necessarily happen like that. It's just a story about the bitter rivalry between Esau and Yaakov, even in Yaakov's death, right? They're still fighting. So they bury him in the valley in Eretz Moab, opposite Beit Peor. So Amar Brechia, Siman b'toch Siman. They gave you 3 ways to figure out exactly where he's buried. And still nobody has any idea where he's buried. And we're going to stop right here. The next story is going to talk about not knowing where Moshe is buried and stories that come up along that. Just like they didn't know where Yosef is buried, also we're not going to know where Moshe is buried, and people are going to try to figure out where this is. In this case, it's actually going to be Gentiles. Anyway, we'll get to the story and see how it goes in tomorrow's class. Wishing everyone Moadim L'Simcha and a Chag Sameach.